12-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership still awaits congressional approval 7 months after its signing and years after its initial negotiations. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said the Senate won't act on the deal this year, which could push the agreement to the next president. U.S. representatives are also looking for increased trade opportunities through the Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership, or TTIP, but those prospects may have darkened after opposition talk from France and Germany. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension's Brad Lubben to discuss the drawbacks to agriculture if the U.S. can't make progress in those deals. We started by asking for an update on TPP.
TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, we've negotiated it. The agreement was signed. It waited congressional consideration and approval. For practical purposes, that's a dead issue for now. It's not happening before the election. It's based on current conversations, not even really a topic of debate for the lame duck session either. It's something that awaits the Nixon administration if it's to move forward.
That's a follow-up question. Is there any way that this can be saved?
It's interesting to observe, the campaign right now, and you have the two major party candidates who have both been outspoken against trade. One might argue, are they truly against trade, or are they against trade agreements that they didn't negotiate? One might say that in negotiations, every deal that you weren't in the room to negotiate yourself is probably a bad deal, and it seems that some of the candidates sort of feel that. That's maybe a reason why Republicans are loath to trust Democrats with negotiations, and Democrats are traditionally loath to trust Republicans with negotiations. We don't like the other party in the room to be the one settling the deal. Is it really dead? There's a chance that the next administration can't really go back and renegotiate the agreement, but they could demand some side discussions as sort of a parallel to ratification. It's possible to do something like that. It's happened before when the Obama administration implemented the Colombia, Panama, and South Korea trade deals that were negotiated by the Bush administration.
Now, this also comes at a time when TTIP doesn't look very good for passage,
right.
Even for further discussion either.
TTIP is certainly on a much longer time horizon. Negotiations aren't done. Not only do you have the uncertainty here in the U.S. with the presidential election and the direction or preference for trade negotiations of whichever administration takes over, you've got Britain's voted for exit from the European Union. Is that still a two-party negotiations? Might it become three-party negotiations? It changes both the potential benefits and the potential obstacles to negotiating with TTIP.
So outside of these partnerships that the U.S. is a part of, there are other partnerships
right.
that, for instance, Australia and China and India and other Asian nations are
right.
discussing right now that have nothing to do with the U.S. What kind of vacuum would that leave for space between here and there?
Well, it puts us in a position. We as a country can't hardly back up and pursue an isolationist strategy. We might have occasional candidates talk about that, but it's not feasible, or at least conceptually sort of not feasible in the current world. We had TTIP and TPP on the agenda because they would establish not just trade relationships in both directions with major partners, they would establish stronger political relationships in those regions as well. Particularly with TPP, establishing that multi-nation economic and trade zone that brings with it political strength in a region that is also looking at China as a major influencer. That's an important discussion in that region beyond just the trade access. Of course, we're also looking at the economic benefits of trade in general as well. So it's hard to imagine walking away from those discussions.
Is that a big deal if the U.S. would be to be left out of these deals?
It's a big deal. It's a big deal for agriculture. If you look at one sector specifically and think of the market access and the potential to serve those growing markets and the potential to be left behind when other countries negotiate that better access.
What's the answer to why free trade seems to work in other countries, especially if you look at Australia with deals they made in Japan and looking into Asia as well, specifically China? Why does it work there and the U.S. is having so much trouble with it here?
Unfortunately, perhaps the concept of trade, the economics of trade, as we might say, seem to be pretty clear cut. The politics of trade are much more difficult. The same economic analysis that tells us consumers benefit also tells us that certain groups lose. Producers of a commodity that is likely to face increased pressure from imports, those producers might have a more challenging outcome, right? They might lose some of their economic benefits or economic success under liberalized trade. Those groups also tend to be a little bit louder in the political spectrum, and thus you have varying groups about arguing about whether trade is really good or bad. Economists in general say trade is good. Certain groups have reasons to argue against it, and we've clearly politicized the process here. And you're stuck with negotiations in the middle of a presidential campaign. That just further creates the political environment that we're operating in.
Trade data for July released this week show U.S. beef and veal exports were 8% higher than July 2015, while pork exports were up 2%. On the crop side, U.S. corn shipments for the month were 16% higher than a year ago. Soybean exports in July, while a small chunk of the overall total, were up 148% due to much higher buying from China compared with the previous July. For the October through July timeframe, corn shipments are tracking close to the same period a year earlier. Soybean exports are down about 1.4%.